Hello, this is Taewei Wang, and this lecture is on System and Design, Spurrier and Topi book, chapter number 8. Chapter number 8 is a relatively simple chapter, and it presents one of the most important tools in UML language for documenting user story in more detail, and we call this use case narrative. Now, from previous exercise or assignment, you probably already learned that the use case model is consists of two important components. One is this use case diagram, which visually showing the graphic mode in how use case are related to each other, how does use cases break down into modularized component. And the other important component is, of course, this use case narrative. Some place or some books will call this use case description. Use case description or use case narrative, they are simply detailed explanation or detailed document for the user story that you have learned in previous chapters. Now, one of the confusing point that you might have is that when we are discussing use case model, activity diagram are usually used as a tool to describe the process that need to be documented in use case model. As a matter of fact, it is not true. Activity diagram is a different diagram present purely on the process view of a particular system that you are analyzing or designing. And it is a tool, however, can be used to elaborate on the use case details, in this case, use case narrative. So in the way that you can describe a process, a business process, or a system process, use either a use case narrative or you can use activity diagram or both. And there's no conflict of you use both of them or just choose to use one of them. Now, the benefit of use case narrative is because new use case narrative is written in the textual format, and from the computer management perspective, textual format is much easier to be searched, to be indexed. So the keywords, the activity that you describe in narrative is much more easier to be documented. If you use activity diagram to describe the same process and interaction, it can still be managed, but you may require to use a specialized case tools or any documentation tool such as IBM Rational Doors or Visual Paradigm. Those are the two just came to my mind on the market that you can find to manage the requirement using use case model. It is also a perfect opportunity to describe UML language. UML language compared to many other, you can say, more rigorous programming language in the system developing world, or other modeling language such as data flow diagram or even traditional flowchart. UML is more a open-ended language. If you want to, I think that's the best way to describe it. Open-ended because UML provide a lot of flexibility for you to use, to expand, to add vocabulary in, and they offer different type of diagram. You can use the combination of these 9 different diagrams and even create one of your own by deriving from the existing diagram. So it is a rather flexible language, and the main goal is that you have to create a document that is consistent, following the convention. You can communicate with other developers, especially working in a team in a larger organization, and that is the key point for standardize these documentations. The official definition of a use case narrative is a textual document that expands on the user story to provide more context, more details in the business process logic, and put together all type of requirement into an integral whole. And of course, the keywords here is the requirement. You got to identify the important activities or tasks required to be building into either your business process or information system. So earlier in previous chapter, you probably read this user story as simple as a particular user or more than one actors that interact with the system and try to get something benefit out of the system by using this story. And from the story, you may encounter or be explained the business process step by step to achieve the entire process. Now, what you can see on this particular slide is that you see the process has been modularized into three different use cases. So one of the important questions is how do we decide on how to modularize, how to divide a completed business process into different kind of components in here. They are, however, outside of the textbook description. I like to offer two principles. The first principle is that most of the use case that we identify as a module is based on a relatively clear transaction. So when you identify a use case that is a transaction by itself, and you can somehow detach the use case from other use case, so the dependency among use case will be less. The second principle is right size. And a right size has a lot of meaning. It can be the right size of computer program, right size of complexity. It can be also be the right size of the job that you can carry out in a project team in a reasonable time frame. So if you combine this with agile methodologies such as the Scrum mechanism that we learn in other chapter, that right size is usually considered for use case. In this case, will be that we try to put together this use case detail that is complicated enough for a project team or a particular programmer, a developer to work on within one sprint or one Scrum. And one sprint, one Scrum usually have the time frame of 1 week or 1 month. So I would say the right size from the perspective of team collaboration and work management is each use case is roughly at 1 week of work. Then that will be a right size of use case. So once you're ready, then you can start building your use case narrative by considering the right size principle and the transaction or independent transaction principle, and then you can start talking about the detail from the user story into a more detailed description of the requirement. And use case narrative can be very detailed all the way down to the design level, meaning that you're going to be providing programming detail. What function is going to be written? What is the variable going to be passing from one function to another? And what is the return variable or value you expect to gain from writing this use case narrative? And at the end of the transaction, what you get out of it. But it can also be very rough and used in the earlier business analyst kind of stage of description, describing mainly from the business requirements perspective. But your textbook offer you some sort of a example to give you a sense of how much detail that you can present at a different level of use case narrative. And this is an example of more like I would say median size of the flow in terms of the narrative. So you have like 8 different steps describing in a textual format. And this is actually already being a main body of a use case narrative already. But if you examine every business process or any information system process, you will find that there are a lot. There are not only the sequential process you can describe. You also need to describe alternative process. Now, in a flowchart or in an activity diagram, we usually use a yes or no branch decision point to describe that kind of branch out. But in narrow description, is a little bit more difficult because when we read an article or read a document, it's unidirection. You read from top to the bottom, and if you want to describe this branch out or logic structure that in our process logic, you need to use some method. In this case, use case narrative use the numbering convention to describe the different branches of or different level of detail you can describe in use case. And the branches and the level is described in this number dot format. So usually the first number will be the main process, and the second number, or in this case letter, will be the subsequent process. So in this case, if you see we have process number 5A, it means that we have an alternative or process 5 that have one alternative. If you see 5B, then the B will be another alternative. And under 5A and 5B, you still have sub-process to describe. So 5A have 1, 2, 3, 4. You can even describe more branches under 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5.8.1 dot, and you get another A as well. So this can go on forever. But to keep the right size principle in mind that we have earlier, usually we try to get to the level of detail in use case narrative not to exceed 1 or 2 branches in the structure of your logic. If you need a higher level or more complicated logic structure, the recommendation that I can give you is that probably use the structure inside among the dependency of use case to achieve that particular purpose. Now, in UML language, if your system is even more complicated, there are other mechanisms. One of the mechanisms is using something what we call package. You can package several use cases together, become one module, and use that module. Then you can create more complicated relationship and alternative. And you can create module within the module or package within the package to create multi-layer nested structure. But we are going too far out of this use case narrative. Let's pull back from the example of use case narrative. A typical use case narrative is a structured document, and it provides headings, and so the system analysts can go out to the field once they collect their interviews or document reviewing result, and they will document them into the use case. And this is usually a team effort. You talk to your team, decided on the size of your use case and how do you name them, and negotiate and figure out the requirement, the title, who created this, and put them into different section of the document, and you're pretty much done. The central part of this particular document, as you can probably see, the longest description is on the part called the scope, context, and background. And this is a very high level use case narrative. And the second most important part of the context is on the next page you can see. It's called the main scenario. Main scenario is the part of the use case narrative. You can document it together with activity diagram to explain more visually in the same thing. And this is actually the butter and the meat of the entire use case narrative. And this is an example of one way of writing use case narrative, and it is a very good template. And not all the field in this particular template sometimes can be filled completely, but the part of the context described earlier on top upper portion, scope, context, and background, as well as the main scenario need to describe in very much detail in this particular document. And for the alternative scenario extension that you can put them into the separate section. As a matter of fact, in my some of my software training classes earlier in the 2000, somewhere around year 2000, when I received UML training, one of the instructors actually recommend try not to create alternative scenario, especially when you are trying to write the use case narrative as a system analyst. And this is something what they call as a sunny day scenario. So when we try to describe or study a system activity, especially during the analysis stage, not in the design stage, analysis stage, we try to create multiple use cases for alternative scenario. In that way, each use case will be simple enough to be managed, and later you kind of merge them together to come up with a better logical design in terms of the use case document. And as you can probably see, the document is quite long, has a lot of sections. You have, in this case, acceptance criteria, and next section you have test cases, and this can be used by the software tester that they can design testing plan. So when you written out this application or function, they can use these criteria or even a small program to test your output. So in theory, every use case that you identify in the use case diagram can be expanded to a very detailed use case narrative, but not all of them. Some of the use case a lot of time in your project are already written, and it can be modularized as well. So you see there's some dependency that you can find among use case. For example, one typical scenario we have here is this login use case. There are a lot of this use case that in your organization setting require login, and your program is probably already have this login feature. So what you need to know or do in getting that requirement is that you will describe the login as one step in your narrative, and the login will become a dependency relationship that you can include in your use case model. And this is also something I mentioned about the right size. And when you have a difficulty of including too much detail in one use case, you break them up and try to manage their interdependency at the use case diagram level, not at the narrative level. Narrative is always about the finest detail that you're going to be getting to the requirement, and sometimes, as I mentioned earlier, go into the programming detail. But when you reach the structural level, then you always use a more higher level pictures or diagram or tool to document the higher level structure. A use case narrative also can be described in various level of detail. Can be a brief use case, can be a casual, or can be a fully dressed use case. Again, UML is a very flexible language. There is no strict rules as which level you have to use or even consistently. In one project, you can have one use case written very simple. The other use case, probably more important one, you want to make sure that your developers and programmer follow your requirement. You can write in more detail use cases to make sure that you hold their hand and say, this is what I want you to do. And you can use a fully addressed use case description. So again, the template is right here, and hopefully that when you go to your working environment, you can use this as a reference and try to see how you can create a use case culture. If you do not have any yet in your organization, try to convert all the verbal or very lengthy flowchart type of document into use case model, and this will modularize and make your software or application building process or purchasing process or configuration process much more efficient and manageable. In terms of the impact and usage of use cases, you can probably see from this picture or the pie chart, actually the profile chart or so-called web charts. It is more important in a requirement-driven type of project, and it is very important in terms of team management. And that is why the right size of the use case is very important, because you want to make sure that use case is designed in a way that you can push to a team and they can finish up in a reasonable amount of time. And you can measure them based on the criteria you describe in your narrative. So again, depends on how much you want to control your design and the development team, that you want to provide more or less detail in your use case description. And the more detail you provide, the more stable your requirement. But you also taking away the flexibility of the programmers or developer. They can provide their contribution into how they're going to be implementing your ideas. And your textbook provide a few guidelines to see how much detail you want to put into this narrative. I would say use this as a reference. For example, the team size, the bigger team size, the more detail you want to provide. The more skilled the among member that probably provide more detail. But if this is a general team and not so sophisticated in technology, you provide less detail. That sort of discussion. But it's set of recommendation, and it's pretty good. And I would say yes, they do impact the size of the use case and how much detail you want to provide in the use case. And also, when you present your use case to different audience, you want to present maybe different version of use case to different audience. User goal level, you provide those with the user to look at how they can expect from the system for you implement the system. And you have summary level use case provided to probably middle to higher level decision maker, and you have sub-function level provide to a more technical step in the process. And then you decided on how to modularize them. Can be one story, one use case, or one story to many use cases, or several use cases and merge them together. Depends on the right size that you decided on, how detailed you want to provide in each level. The key now is you need to document in more or less completely of the requirement that you discover in your analysis process, as well as that you want to make sure that your document is readable, organized in a way that it's easy to be disassembled, modularized, managed, assign job to different people, different group, and that will achieve the purpose of using the use case model. And that will be the two principle again, like to emphasize again, right size principle and transaction principle to complete a use case model. So that's it. That's our chapter number 8, and I will talk to you in another lecture.